March 1946. Camp Concordia, Kansas. 600 German prisoners stared at steaming trays of food. Not one touched their plate. The Kansas wind battered the wooden barracks outside. Inside, American guards exchanged confused glances. These men weren't protesting cruel treatment. They weren't demanding better conditions. They were refusing something no army had ever seen prisoners reject: their own freedom. Hans Schmidt, a former Afrika Korps soldier who had spent 30 months harvesting sugar beets alongside local farmers, rose slowly from his bench. His English was fluent now, shaped by years of conversation with the Americans who guarded him. "We cannot eat," he announced, voice steady across the silent mess hall. "Not until we receive written assurance that we will not be returned to Germany." Colonel Francis Howard stood near the entrance, a crumpled telegram in his hand. Washington's orders were unambiguous. The Geneva Convention required immediate repatriation of all German prisoners of war. He had expected these men to celebrate. Instead, he faced a mutiny against liberation itself. This is the forgotten story of a rebellion that history nearly erased. A protest not against imprisonment, but against release. And it exposes a truth about World War II that neither Berlin nor Washington wanted examined too closely. The strange case of enemies who found home behind barbed wire. To grasp why German soldiers fought to remain in American captivity, you must understand what their imprisonment actually looked like. Nothing matched the nightmare their commanders had promised. When Lieutenant Werner Kritzinger was captured in Tunisia during May 1943, Nazi propaganda had prepared him for torture, starvation, and execution. His transport across the Atlantic in a crowded ship's hold felt like a journey toward death. What awaited him at Camp Hearn, Texas, defied comprehension. "I could not trust my eyes," Kritzinger later wrote in a letter preserved at the National Archives. "American guards handed us Coca-Cola. We had survived on black bread for years. They treated us like guests, not enemies." By late 1945, the United States held roughly 425,000 German POWs across more than 700 facilities nationwide. This represented the largest prisoner operation in American history. Camps stretched from New York's Camp Pine to Iowa's Camp Clarinda, from Texas's Camp Mexia to Idaho's Camp Rupert. What made these facilities extraordinary wasn't their security. It was their philosophy. The Geneva Convention required certain standards. America exceeded them dramatically. German prisoners received 4,000 calories daily. That exceeded what American civilians could obtain through ration books. It nearly doubled what German citizens ate in their bombed-out cities by 1944. Prisoners earned 80 cents per day in camp currency for labor. They borrowed books from libraries. They played soccer, baseball, and volleyball. Many camps operated their own newspapers, theaters, and full orchestras. At Camp Como, Mississippi, German prisoners published Der Ruf, The Call, featuring book reviews, poetry, and philosophical debates. At Camp Mexia, they constructed an elaborate miniature German village complete with a functioning fountain. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, a 50-piece symphony performed Beethoven and Mozart for local townspeople. Gunther Werner, captured during the Normandy fighting in August 1944, had lost 40 pounds during combat. Within 4 months at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, he had regained every pound. But the weight came with guilt. "My mother wrote about surviving on turnips and potato peels," he recalled in a 1983 interview with the U.S. Army Military History Institute. "And here I was eating roast beef and ice cream." Yet food was only half the story. What truly transformed these men was something no Geneva article had anticipated: ordinary human contact across the wire. The prisoner labor program changed everything. With American men fighting overseas, farms faced catastrophic shortages. Starting in 1943, German POWs were contracted to work fields, canneries, and lumber camps nationwide. Every morning at Camp Concordia, trucks arrived to carry prisoners to local farms. These weren't mere work details. They became unexpected cultural exchanges that neither side had imagined. German POWs ate lunch at farmhouse tables. They learned English from farmers' children. They celebrated Thanksgiving and Christmas with American families. Despite official fraternization bans, some fell in love. Martha Mueller, a German-American farm wife in Kansas, later recalled, "3 German boys worked our wheat harvest in 1944. My husband was overseas fighting. I was feeding enemy soldiers at my kitchen table. But they weren't monsters from newsreels. They were homesick boys showing me pictures of their mothers, asking if my husband was safe." The transformation flowed both directions. American farmers who had wanted vengeance discovered individuals beneath the uniforms. German soldiers raised on propaganda about American degeneracy found abundance, kindness, and something they hadn't expected, normalcy. By mid-1945, over 200,000 German POWs worked outside their camps. They harvested Texas cotton, California fruit, Minnesota timber, and Colorado sugar beets. They earned money. They sent letters home describing what they saw. And they began imagining futures that didn't involve returning to a destroyed Germany. Have you ever realized the place you feared most had become the only home you had left? Hauptmann Eric Siebold, a Luftwaffe officer held at Camp McCain, Mississippi, wrote in his diary on June 15, 1945, "Today I learned the war in Europe has ended. I expected joy. Instead, I feel dread. What happens to us now? Do we return to the wasteland Germany has become? My city, Dresden, no longer exists. My parents are dead. What remains for me there?" This question haunted thousands as 1945 closed. And it was a question Washington was not prepared to answer the way these prisoners hoped. On January 4, 1946, the War Department issued General Order No. 12. All German POWs would be repatriated with maximum speed, per Geneva Convention requirements. The goal, every prisoner returned to Germany by July 1946. The announcement electrified the camp system. At Camp Ruston, Louisiana, the prisoner compound's commandant, Oberleutnant Klaus Mittendorf, immediately noticed the change. The men became quiet, he reported to American authorities. No evening singing. Many stopped eating properly. Several requested the camp chaplain, something they had never done before. The statistics painted a grim picture of what awaited them. By early 1946, 20% of Berlin was rubble. Hamburg had lost half its housing. Cologne's population had plummeted from 750,000 to 40,000. Daily calories in the British occupation zone had fallen to 1,400, starvation levels. The Soviet zone was even worse. More frightening was the uncertainty. Germany had been carved into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Prisoners had no control over which zone would receive them. Stories of Soviet treatment of German prisoners were terrifying. Of the approximately 3 million German POWs captured by the Soviets, an estimated 1 million died in captivity. Even those from Western Germany faced catastrophe. No housing. Minimal food. No economy. Many prisoners knew their families were dead or displaced. Some learned their hometowns now lay inside Soviet-controlled territory, making return impossible. But there was something deeper. Something many prisoners struggled to articulate even to themselves. They had changed. After years in America, they no longer fit the Germany they had left behind. And that Germany no longer existed. On January 18, 1946, at Camp Concordia, a group of prisoners drafted a petition. Written in careful English, addressed to President Harry Truman, the document preserved in the National Archives reads in part, "We, the undersigned, respectfully request permission to remain in the United States of America. We have worked honestly for American farmers who will testify to our character. We have learned to respect American democracy and wish to become citizens. Germany is destroyed and holds nothing for us. We prefer to remain as prisoners if necessary rather than return to certain starvation and possibly death." 347 men signed. Similar petitions appeared nationwide. At Camp Hearn, Texas, 412 prisoners signed. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, 289 signed. At Camp Clark, Missouri, over 500 signed. Washington's answer was absolute. No. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. No exceptions. That's when the resistance began. The first hunger strike erupted at Camp Concordia on February 12, 1946, the scene that opened this story. Within a week, Similar strikes spread to camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. American camp commanders were baffled. Colonel Howard at Concordia had handled routine disciplinary problems, fights between Nazi hardliners and anti-Nazi prisoners, minor work refusals, escape attempts. But this was unprecedented. "How do I discipline men for not wanting to leave prison?" he wrote in a February 18 report to the War Department. "These are not violent men. They're not destroying property. They're simply refusing to cooperate with their own liberation." The strikes weren't the only form of resistance. At Camp Dermot, Arkansas, prisoners staged coordinated work slowdowns, completing at half speed what they had previously done efficiently. Local farmers who had contracted their labor complained to camp administration. "These boys have worked hard for us for 2 years, one farmer wrote to his congressman. Now you're sending them back to starvation. Where's the humanity in that?" At Camp Como, Mississippi, a group of prisoners hired a local attorney using their accumulated work wages. The lawyer, a young man named Robert Hutchinson, actually researched immigration law and wrote to the State Department. His February 1946 brief argued that German POWs who had performed essential civilian labor should qualify for special immigration status. Can you imagine hiring a lawyer to argue you should stay in prison? The State Department's response was swift and negative. Granting such requests would violate international law, undermine the Geneva Convention, and create impossible precedents. But the prisoners' resistance grew more creative and desperate. At Camp Hearn, Texas, a prisoner named Joseph Kramer had fallen in love with a German-American woman named Anna Schneider. Her family owned the dairy farm where he had worked for 18 months. Fraternization was forbidden, but relationships had formed in the relative freedom of work assignments. Kramer proposed marriage, hoping it might provide legal grounds to stay. Anna applied for permission to marry him. The army denied it. Immigration authorities made clear that even if they married, Kramer would still be deported, and Anna, as an American citizen, would have to choose between her country and her husband. On March 15, 1946, Kramer attempted suicide by cutting his wrists. He survived. But the incident sent shockwaves through the camp system. Military intelligence began monitoring for similar cases. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, prisoners stopped singing German songs in the evenings, a tradition for years. Instead, they sang American songs they had learned, Home on the Range, You Are My Sunshine, even the Star-Spangled Banner. It was a quiet, mournful protest. A way of declaring who they felt they had become. The American guards, many of whom had formed friendships over years of service, struggled with their orders. Private First Class James Morrison, a guard at Camp Trinidad, wrote in a March 22 letter home, "We're packing up boys who've worked beside us, eaten with us, played baseball with us. Some are crying. Others just look dead inside. I joined up to fight Germans, and I did. But these don't feel like the enemy anymore." Behind the statistics and strikes were individual human stories of heartbreaking complexity. Wilhelm Lentz had been captured at Salerno, Italy, in September 1943. He spent nearly 3 years at Camp Swift, Texas, working as a carpenter. When he learned his hometown of Dresden had been destroyed in the February 1945 firebombing, he received confirmation that his entire family was dead. Parents, sister, fiancé. What was he returning to? Lentz wrote to the camp chaplain, Father William O'Connor, in a letter preserved in the Catholic Diocese of Austin archives, dated April 3, 1946, "Father, I believe in God's plan, but I cannot understand it. I survived the war only to be sent back to a graveyard. Everyone I loved is dead. The city I knew is ash. Here in Texas, I have friends. I have purpose. The family I work for treats me like a son. Why must I leave life to return to death?" Father O'Connor tried to intervene with military authorities on Lentz's behalf. He was told politely but firmly that exceptions were impossible. Then there was Helmuth Friedrich, a former teacher from Hamburg captured in France in 1944. At Camp Mexia, Texas, Friedrich taught English to other prisoners and German to interested American guards. He had developed a friendship with the camp's education officer, Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, bonding over shared love of literature. When repatriation orders came, Bradley wrote a formal letter of recommendation, This man represents the best of what Germany could become. He believes in democracy, has completely rejected Nazi ideology, and would be an asset to our nation. The letter was filed and forgotten. Friedrich was shipped back to Germany in May 1946. At Camp Clark, Missouri, a prisoner named Carl Becker had become close to a local farming family named Wilson. The Wilson's son had been killed at Normandy. Initially hostile to German prisoners, they found something unexpected working alongside Becker over time. Not forgiveness exactly. Something more complex. When Becker was scheduled for deportation, Mr. Wilson drove to the camp and asked to see the commander. "I know this is unusual," he said, according to an April 10 report filed by the camp adjutant. "My boy died fighting Germans. But Carl isn't who killed him. Can't we see the difference? Carl wants to stay. We want him to stay. He could work our farm. Why isn't that possible?" The commander had no answer that satisfied anyone. Despite protests, petitions, and pleas, repatriation proceeded on schedule. The process was systematic and impersonal. Prisoners loaded onto trains, transported to ports, placed on Liberty ships bound for Europe. Most delivered to ports in France and England, then transferred to camps in occupied Germany. At Camp Concordia, the hunger strike ended not because prisoners changed their minds, but because camp authorities threatened to force-feed strikers and punish them with solitary confinement before deportation. Faced with spending their final days in America in isolation, most chose to eat and spend their remaining time with friends. The final transports left American camps between April and July 1946. At Camp Hearn, local townspeople came to the fence to say goodbye, unprecedented. Some brought gifts. Food for the journey. Addresses for letters. Photographs. German prisoners lined up for roll call one last time, collected their few possessions, and marched to waiting trucks under armed guard. Many wept openly. On May 23, 1946, the last group of prisoners left Camp Concordia. Hans Schmidt, the man who had announced the hunger strike 4 months earlier, was among them. As the truck pulled away, he looked back at the camp, at the Kansas prairie, at the country that had been his home longer than anywhere since the war began. An American guard who witnessed the departure later recalled, "They looked like men going to execution, not men going home." What happens to people who outgrow the only home they've ever known? The fate of repatriated prisoners varied dramatically. Those sent to American, British, or French zones faced severe hardship but generally survived. They returned to cities of rubble, an economy in collapse, a population traumatized and divided. For those whose homes were now in the Soviet zone, the situation was far worse. Many were immediately rearrested and sent to Soviet labor camps. Others disappeared into a police state where their time in America made them suspect. A few prisoners eventually made it back to America, though it took years. Wilhelm Lentz, the carpenter from Dresden, immigrated to the United States in 1952 under the Displaced Persons Act. He settled in Texas, not far from Camp Swift, where he had been imprisoned. He worked as a carpenter until his death in 1989. Helmuth Friedrich also eventually immigrated. Arriving in 1954, he taught German at a high school in Missouri and wrote a 1976 memoir titled Prisoner of Peace about his conflicted experience as a German POW in America. Carl Becker managed to return in 1953, sponsored by the Wilson family in Missouri. He worked their farm for 20 years, never married, and was buried in the Wilson family plot when he died in 1973. But these were exceptions. Most never returned. They rebuilt lives in Germany, carried memories of America like ghosts, and rarely spoke about their time as prisoners who had fought to stay imprisoned. Joseph Kramer, who attempted suicide rather than leave Anna Schneider, survived and was deported. Anna waited 3 years, then traveled to Germany to find him in 1949. They married in Munich. She stayed in Germany with him, giving up her American citizenship, the reverse of what they had hoped. Why has this story been so thoroughly forgotten? Partly because it complicated the narrative both sides wanted to tell. For America, the story of German POWs who loved captivity raised uncomfortable questions about why prisoners lived better than many American civilians, especially Black Americans still subject to Jim Crow laws. Several camps where Germans were held had better facilities than nearby African American neighborhoods. That fact did not escape notice. For Germany, the story was even more uncomfortable. It suggested that some German soldiers had preferred America to the fatherland, challenging post-war narratives of universal German suffering and victimhood. But perhaps most significantly, it was forgotten because it humanized the enemy in ways that didn't fit clean categories. These weren't concentration camp guards or SS fanatics. They were ordinary soldiers who had discovered in captivity that the enemy they'd been taught to hate was more humane than the regime they'd served. The military files on prisoner resistance to repatriation were classified for decades. When finally opened, they revealed the scale of the protests. At least 15,000 German POWs across more than 30 camps had participated in some form of resistance: hunger strikes, petitions, work stoppages, legal appeals. None of it changed the outcome. By August 1946, fewer than 5,000 German POWs remained in the United States, mostly those deemed too sick to travel or those facing war crimes investigations. By 1947, the camps were empty. The last documented letter from a German POW protesting repatriation is dated June 30, 1946, from Camp Shanks, New York, a staging area for deportation. The prisoner's name was Heinrich Müller. He wrote to the camp commander, "I do not ask to avoid punishment for my country's crimes. I ask only to be allowed to stay and build something better than what we destroyed. Is that not justice too?" No response is recorded in his file. He was shipped to Germany on July 5, 1946. The story of German POWs who fought to stay in America reveals something profound about ideology, identity, and human connection. These men had been raised in a totalitarian state, indoctrinated with propaganda about racial superiority and the degeneracy of democracy. They had fought for Hitler's vision of Europe. And yet, when confronted with the reality of American life, not perfect, not without its own deep injustices, but fundamentally different from what they'd been told, many of them changed. They changed not through punishment or re-education programs, but through ordinary human contact. Through eating at farmhouse tables. Through working alongside people they'd been taught to despise. Through discovering that the enemy wasn't monstrous, just human. And when given the choice between returning to a familiar ideology in ruins or embracing a new future in a foreign land, thousands chose the latter. They chose it knowing they might never see their families again. They chose it knowing they'd be marked as traitors by some. They chose it through the desperate logic of people who had seen both sides and understood the difference. The rebellion failed, of course. The Geneva Convention was clear. International law demanded repatriation. The United States could not simply absorb hundreds of thousands of former enemy soldiers, no matter how reformed they appeared. They came as enemies and found a future. Being forced to leave felt not like liberation, but like a second capture. But the fact that it happened at all, that German soldiers would hunger strike to stay in prison camps, that American farmers would plead for prisoners to remain, that the lines between captor and captive could blur so completely, tells us something essential about the human capacity for change and connection, even in history's darkest chapter. In February 1946, in a Kansas mess hall, 600 men refused to eat because they wanted to stay in prison. It was a rebellion that made no sense by the logic of war. But by the logic of human transformation, it made perfect sense. They had come to America as enemies and found something they hadn't expected. A future. Being forced to give it up felt not like liberation, but like a second capture. This time, a capture by fate, by law, by the implacable demands of history. And so they resisted, knowing it was futile, because the alternative was accepting that what they discovered about America, about themselves, about the possibility of becoming something different, remembered. Not as a curiosity, but as a testament to the human capacity for change and the tragedy of circumstances that prevent that change from being fully realized. The camps are gone now. Most have been completely erased, returned to farmland, converted to other uses, or simply abandoned to decay. But in the archives, the letters remain. The petitions. The reports of hunger strikes and desperate pleas. And somewhere in those documents is a truth that neither side wanted to acknowledge. That even in war, people are capable of becoming more than their circumstances would suggest. Sometimes even prisoners can be transformed. Sometimes even enemies can become neighbors. If you found this story as powerful as we did, like this video and subscribe to War Real History for more forgotten history that challenges everything you thought you knew. This response is AI generated, for reference only.